Well, good evening, Warbird Tube fans, and thanks for joining us and with us tonight. A very special guest, Bruce Campbell. Bruce, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be back with you again, Steve.
We're going to talk a little bit about Richard Bong, America's ace of aces tonight, and especially focusing in on a kind of solemn anniversary that's coming up this month, and that is his loss in a fatal crash of the P-80. And Bruce, you've done a lot of research on Dick Bong, and hopefully folks will learn some things about his stellar career before we're done tonight.
I hope so. Yeah, he was a remarkable individual.
He certainly was.
Despite his young age, and he accomplished a lot as a modest young man.
He certainly did. We'll get into depth in that in just a moment. But again, if you are joining us for the first time, welcome to Warbird Tube. If you're back for a repeat visit, well, welcome back. We're glad to have you with us. And don't forget, if you like what you see, please spread the word on your favorite social media platform. We do appreciate it. Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, where our aircraft are touring this summer and fall, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. So as we said, we're going to talk about Major Richard Ira Bong and the ace of aces. And Bruce, you've done quite a bit of research on him. How did you get interested in Richard?
I made a trip up to the Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin several years ago with the idea of writing a biography about him. I was always captivated by his achievements and his humble background, and also by the circumstances surrounding his loss. Coming up 80 years ago, well, it'll be 80 years ago today, August 6, 1945. And he was just such an intriguing person that I wanted to do a deep dive into his background. I had written about him in my trilogy about Rabal. Mm-hmm. As a P-38 pilot, he was involved in some of the hairy missions over Rabal, and lost a couple of wingmen on some of those missions. And so I just had already learned about him, and I learned about the whole P-38 organization and history over there, and wanted to follow up with that.
Well, good. Well, let's start at the beginning. You said Poplar, Wisconsin. It's very small. It still is a very small community, but is there nonetheless?
Yeah, it's a tiny little community east of Superior, Wisconsin. It's a few miles south of Lake Superior. Really just a farming community with a couple of small stores, like a hardware store, and maybe one or two churches, and there was one schoolhouse there. Richard was born in September of 1920 and was the first of 9 children. His father was a Swedish immigrant, came over as a very young person in the late 1800s, and they, just a farm family. They had a spread of about 80 acres, and then also farmed some other lands that they leased out. But it was a busy, happy, crowded home, and it just, church going. They were Lutherans. He grew up spending a lot of time outdoors. He was very adventurous, and loved aviation from a young age. He was maybe just 6 or 7 when President Cleveland used to have his airmail delivered to summer White House or a summer camp nearby. And when that plane would fly over on a regular basis, he would just stare up at the sky and just get, his eyes would glaze over. He was really enamored with airplanes after that. Spent a lot of time in his youth building models and hanging out with friends outdoors. So from a very early age, he really knew that he wanted to become a pilot if the opportunity arose.
In high school, was he more of an athlete or a bookworm or a combination?
I would say more of an athlete, really. Okay. He was not a big guy. His stature was maybe 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", somewhere in that neighborhood. So he was stocky and a real noted baseball player in the youth leagues around the area, the summer leagues. He was quite a good batter and pitcher. He also played hockey in the winter, like so many kids did growing up in Wisconsin. So he was very athletic. And also, you had shown the photograph of that big diesel tractor that his dad used for clearing roads and skidding timber. That big tractor had heavy clutch pedals and hand controls. And even as a teenager, Dick Bong would manipulate that massive machine around on the farm, and it helped him develop coordination as well as really building leg strength. I mean, it was like using a leg press to manipulate those pedals. So yeah, he was well coordinated, athletic, and smart enough to do well in school.
When did he join the Air Corps?
He graduated from high school in 1938, and then for a couple of years attended Superior State Teachers College, which is now, I think it's part of the University of Wisconsin Superior. Mm-hmm. And after 2 years, then he, at some point during those 2 years, he joined the civilian pilot training program that was part of the huge expansion in military aviation that started to take place right after, when the threat started to become real. 1938, 1939, of course, World War II broke out in September of 1939 in Europe, and there was a very rapid expansion in military aviation at that point. And that civilian pilot training program was how students all around the country were able to get some flying experience. So he took advantage of that and learned to fly at the local airport there in Superior and soloed. And then in 1941, he became an aviation cadet and went through the Army's flight training program.
And he followed you followed the standard pattern of the training aircraft from the very simple to the very complex, like the T6.
Exactly.
And this photo really shows his stature, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. It could be that the two guys on either side of him were unusually tall and sort of exaggerated the difference. But yeah, he was not a tall person at all. And this was taken in California, and I believe it was the Rankin Flying School where he went for his basic training and flew Stearmans. You can see a Stearman there. And as a student, did fine. He went through the regular progression of flight training and then ended up flying the T6 Texan in advanced training and was recycled back to Luke Field in Arizona as a flight instructor. So he did get extra flying there at Luke Field in Arizona before getting his dream and being assigned to a P-38 squadron at, I think this is Hamilton Field, just outside of San Francisco. And this is the 49th Fighter Squadron, his first P-38 assignment. And he is in the back row at the far left. So again, you can see he's really the shortest guy on the row. Yep, right over there where your mouse is pointing. He flew there in the operational squadron, but it was part of the 4th Air Force, main side in the States. And it was there that he sort of began his unique reputation with something that's sort of mythological, partly true, partly not, where he was supposedly one of 4 guys who flew under the Golden Gate Bridge and then looped and looped up over the bridge and flew under it again. He always denied that he was part of that shenanigan, but the myth is that he was part of it. What he did do, though, was do some flat hatting, some low altitude buzzing over a neighborhood where a friend of his, maybe a squadron mate, lived, and really rattled some windows and blew clothes off clotheslines and that kind of thing. And he was called on the carpet in front of the commanding general of the 4th Air Force, who was General George Kenney at that time. And Kenney, in his autobiography, writes about this small, what he called blonde-haired Swedish boy, coming in to his office, and Kenney read him the Riot Act and grounded him for 6 weeks, during which Bong had to sit in the radar intercept trailer and work intercepts on the ground. But eventually he was back in the air, and the rest of the squadron, meanwhile, the 49th, went over to North Africa, and Bong was shuffled then over to the Southwest Pacific, which I think was fate. He was fated to go over there where there was a whole lot of aerial action, and arrived there in late 1942.
Was the P-38 his goal, or was he just interested in flying any of the fighters?
Well, I'm not sure that the P-38 specifically was his goal. The P-40 was also considered, a hot fighter, even though later we realized how badly outclassed it was as far as lack of altitude capability and so forth. But it was considered a hot fighter back then, and the P-39 was around. So there were options, but I'm sure from his personality that fighters would have been his first choice, and he landed that. So he gets out to the Southwest Pacific in November of 1942, and this is a wartime map. You can see it's dated at the top, 1942. Mm-hmm. And the blue line shows the boundary of the Southwest Pacific area, which was General MacArthur's area. That was his realm during this time. And the very northern part of Australia is shown at the bottom of the map. And then right above that is this bird-shaped, kind of looks like a cross between a bird and a dinosaur in profile, which is the huge island of New Guinea. And Bong was assigned at first to the Port Moresby area in late 1942, early 1943, and eventually ended up with the 9th Fighter Squadron, flying missions out of the Port Moresby area, and then later being part of the Army's advance up through New Guinea. Great shot here of 2 P-38s buzzing the fighter strip. I believe this is what they call 14-mile airdrome, 14 miles outside of Port Moresby. And this slide and some of the next slides will show some of the conditions there. They were really primitive. They lived in sort of native-built tents, or maybe up on platforms because of the insects and crabs and rats and things, but they would pitch their canvas pyramidal tents over basically bamboo and lumber tent platforms. Their dining hall was sort of a native-built type structure. So there was not very good sanitation, not very good food. Everything was either dehydrated or preserved or whatnot. There really wasn't much in the way of fresh food or staples. And so their diet was rather poor. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of heat and humidity. So the conditions were primitive and really taxing on a person's health and stamina.
As you said, Bruce, the conditions there were less than ideal. And I think that's why there's so many pictures we see. There are some coming up in your slides, but a lot of the pictures of pilots that were in the Pacific, they always looked so rumpled and not very well put together. But that's really the result of the environment they lived in. Nothing was you couldn't press anything or have a nice looking uniform. Everything was just sort of rumpled because of the heat and humidity.
That's exactly right, Steve. They wore the same flight suits and clothing, and they washed them occasionally when they could, but nothing really would dry out. And so, of course, the conditions were that they would just perspire so profusely that their flight suits would become encrusted with salt from that leached out after as the perspiration evaporated. So everything was really difficult and challenging for them, and their weight would drop. Lack of sleep would affect them. So and General Kenny, from Kenny on down, they were interested in results, not in a neat appearance.
Yes. And
so they did what they could to keep the pilots happy, and they sort of let their grooming standards slack off a little bit, and it was casual, but it had to be for a reason.
Yes.
Here we see one of the earlier model of the P-38. I am not an airplane expert by any means. I'm really more of a personality type of researcher. So this is one of the earlier models prior to the J model that had the more defined scoops under the props. And these are taken in New Guinea. We can sort of scroll through a few of these that show the jungle environment, just bare dirt and a lot of the forestation around behind them. And it was a very hot environment as we talked about. And so, of course, then the planes got baked outside in these conditions. And once a pilot climbed in, it would be 120 or 130 degrees up there under the canopy for a while until they were able to get airborne and get a little bit of fresh air blowing through. Here we see actually, it may be a mocked up photo or a posed photo, but this shows a scramble as pilots are jumping off of an Army vehicle. We see a pilot running to his P-38, other pilots up on the running boards that they'll be dropped off, 1, 2, 3, 4 along the line of fighters. And so this one has a little bit of drama to it. And again, it shows how dusty and dirty and primitive the conditions there really were. I think that gets overlooked too much, that readers and viewers and so forth just don't have a feel for how hot and sticky and miserable the conditions there were 24/7. It didn't cool down at night, for example.
And it's interesting. We talked about the heat and humidity, but yet at the same time, the dust and dirt that's coming off the vehicle. So it was the worst of all conditions: the heat, the humidity, and the dirt. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. I mean, the runways. I don't know exactly what you would define the type of earth. If it was sort of a clay type earth there in New Guinea, I cannot speak to that. But you can see that, once the sun would bake it, it would turn to dust really quickly. But then you might get a torrential downpour that would turn that into just slick mud that would then dry out and turn back into dust. And it was these extremes that made life so challenging.
With this first deployment that he had, at this point in the war, where he were they mostly defensive, or were they going on offensive missions?
It was a little of both. I would say that the Japanese were still in their campaign to capture New Guinea and attack Port Moresby. So there were a lot of Japanese raids coming down their way, and that's why they would scramble sometimes. But then they would also make their own raids. Allies would make their own raids. And so there was a little bit of both. Certainly going out on sweeps, just trying to find enemy aircraft. And it was during this period, this first combat tour, that lasted basically a full year for Bong, that he shot down the most planes in one tour for him personally. He ended up with 21 victories by November of 1943, which happened to be a mix of single-engine fighters, like, you know, the famed Japanese Zero variants, the Army variant, the Oscar, and other aircraft twin-engine planes like the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, or some other Army variants of the Japanese twin-engine bombers, Sallies, and so forth. So the variety of Japanese planes that he shot down on that first tour was pretty wide. Quite a variety. It wasn't all fighter on fighter that he encountered during that first tour. So with 21 victories by the end of that first tour, he went home in November of 1943 as one of the ranking aces. The victory record at that time stood at 26. It was held jointly by Joe Foss, a Marine pilot from the Guadalcanal campaign, and Eddie Rickenbacker, who was the Medal of Honor winner from World War I. So with 21 victories, Bong was starting to close in on that record and was one of the top scoring aces at the time. So they sent him home to conduct a public relations tour, in part to raise money. War bond drives were a very valid reason to send people home who had a remarkable combat record, because they would basically either go on the radio or go on stage in public events and urge people to buy war bonds, which raised millions and millions and millions of dollars to help fund the war effort. So he did that after that first tour, which went until for about 2 months. He was in Washington, D.C., and New York City, doing all kinds of public relations events. And it was during that period that he was home that he met a girl at Superior State Teachers College at their homecoming event, who was the previous year's homecoming queen. Her name was Marjorie Vattendahl, and they met and started to date, and it became quite serious during that first period that he was back home during this war bond tour.
So after spending some time back here in the States with the war bond tour, he goes back to the Pacific.
That's right. He went back in early 1943, and early 44. Got myself out of sequence. Yeah, back in early 1944, and it was back in New Guinea, and it was there at Dobadura Field. Now they're up on the eastern coast of the Papua New Guinea Peninsula. He was assigned a P-38 that was, quote unquote, his airplane, and he actually took the yearbook photograph of Marge Vattendahl and had someone on the staff there enlarge the photograph, and then it was applied to the fuselage of his airplane, and then the stylized name Marge was added there. So actually that is an enlarged photograph that was, for lack of a better word, glued on with sort of like, I don't know if it was sort of like something of an adhesive that might be used for something like wallpaper, but it was put on in such a way and then probably lacquered over that it stuck. It didn't fly off in flight. And that large photograph and then the stylized lettering was added to his plane. And because of his rising fame as one of the leading aces, then this by itself became a public relations event. And photographers were all over it. I mean, just because most nose art was risque, and Bong was, modest and humble and kind of straight-laced and a quiet guy. But the reporters and correspondents really thought this was terrific. And with the Japanese victory flags on the fuselage, this was publicized pretty widely. So almost overnight, this relationship suddenly became a public event and was written up about. Eventually, as we'll see later on, eventually going to some of the top magazines and newspapers and so forth in the United States. A pretty remarkable love story.
Certainly was.
So he's back for his second tour with the 5th Fighter Command, and he's with pilots who are also rising stars, guys like Tommy McGuire and Tom Lynch and some other hotshot P-38 pilots out there in the theater, and they're all starting to really rack up a lot of victories out there. It's heavy combat on many occasions, and they're still facing some pretty good enemy pilots. So his time over there on the second tour was fairly brief, because it did not take him long, starting out already with 21 victories, to get up to number 26, which tied the record with Voss and Rickenbacker. Those were their scores, their personal scores. And then he scored a 27th victory in the spring of 1944. And that was it. I mean, he broke the record. And because of that, now he really became a national hero and was sent home again for another tour. And this time he traveled all over the country, including out to the West Coast. But first he did meet with Eddie Rickenbacker, who was very gracious about having someone break his record, and was actually, I think, thrilled by it. And they met in person. There was a little bit of a controversy regarding a pledge that Rickenbacker made publicly. He said that when his record was broken, he was going to send a case of scotch to whoever broke his record. And that raised some protests from the abstaining type of people who wrote that, back in that day, they thought it was inappropriate. And so there was a little bit of backlash because he pledged a case of scotch to somebody. So that was just sort of an aside, but it sort of shows what the mindset was among people back then, when there was a little bit maybe more puritanical regard for this sort of thing.
Well, you mentioned his trip out to the West Coast. He did it big and ended up being a friend of Bing Crosby.
That's right. He went out to the West Coast, spent some time in LA. He was introduced to Bing Crosby and actually did some radio broadcasts and studio broadcasts with Crosby. He also met quite a few other personalities out there, people like, back in the day, they would have been young and very famous, people like Angela Lansbury and Lucille Ball. Here's one of the studio photographs of Richard Bong with Bing Crosby as they either get ready to go on air or, they're going over their notes there. And these would be scripted things. They would have producers who would literally write out a script for them, and they would read from the script and try to make it sound as live and, unprepared as possible, but really almost everything was scripted ahead of time for them.
And that's looks like a P-38 there in the background.
It sure does. Yep. I don't know if that was just something they used as a prop, or if he was using that to help explain things when they were talking on air. It's hard to say, but yeah, that looks like a P-38 on a stick there. Yep. This is he's shining a dollar bill, it looks like, or some kind of a thing. But Bing Crosby and oh, good grief, I had her name in mind just a second ago. But it'll come to me probably later on. But just personalities, famous actors and actresses. He was really in tall cotton during that period of time that he spent out on the West Coast.
When was that second war bond tour?
It would have been in the spring of 1944. Okay. Late May into the summer of 1944. And he was back home for a good bit of that time. And now you can see crowded around with the family. There's Marge. Yep. And they've really kind of got their relationship on really solid ground. And they started to talk about getting married, although he did not want to get married as long as the war was still on. Even though he had broken the record, he really wanted to go back for another tour. He said that his work wasn't done. He said there was still a job to do, and he was willing to put everything else on hold. During that time that he was in Poplar, here we can see what this is the main drag going through Poplar. There's a hardware store, a little gas station, 2 or 3 other commercial buildings, and that was about it. I think this photo was actually taken later after he came back from his third tour because of all the ice and snow. Okay. So this was probably taken in February of 1945, but at least it shows the quaintness of Poplar and how he was sort of like the Pied Piper, surrounded by the kids in the village who really looked up to him as he's there in his leather coat and crush cap and so forth. Yep, this is more with. It looks like, man, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to identify exactly if that was McGuire or Lynch or some of the other pilots in the 5th Fighter Command, but it's a good profile picture of Bong with a P-38 and some of his fellow pilots. Again, I apologize for not being able to specifically identify who these guys are. And he did go back for his 5th tour, arriving in late September of 1944. And then like you said, he had a job to do. And General Kinney, who was a real supporter and kind of a mentor for Bong, assigned him to the 5th Fighter Command in sort of a roving gunnery instructor status. Bong had been sent to a gunnery school in Texas after his second combat tour. And so he was assigned to this job where he could rove from one squadron to another within Fighter Command. And it enabled him to cherry pick the missions that would give him the best opportunity to find enemy planes in the air and keep building on his score. So he had 27 when he went back for that tour. He actually was flying over Rabal. This is a little bit out of sequence, Steve, so I don't know if it really matters. This would have been during his period in that first combat tour when he was flying missions over Rabal. Okay. But I think it's sort of emblematic of the air combat and how intense it could be during that period. This shows a major aerial attack in November of 1943 when Bong and dozens and dozens of other fighters and attack aircraft and so forth were flying these concentrated missions against Fortress Rabal. And it just kind of shows how much smoke and destruction and bombing, anti-aircraft fire, white phosphorus bombs on the train. I mean, it was a very intense period of the war, and there were, excuse me, there were a lot of losses, among the pilots. In fact, during his combat tours, Bong did lose 2 of his wingmen who were shot down and never recovered, and that weighed pretty heavily on him. He really did not have an interest in being a leader, as far as like a squadron leader, and being responsible for all of those lives. He knew how tenuous everything was. He was more suited to going out, trying to find enemy planes. I don't think it was his own ego. I think that he just felt there was a job to do, and he knew he was good at it. Yeah. And he didn't want to have other people's lives on his shoulders, except for his own. Maybe if he was a division leader, within his own division of 3 other pilots, that was what he was suited for. But as far as a higher level of command, I don't believe that he had any interest in that. And he sort of was able to work around that and stay more on the division size of flight, where he could go out and shoot down enemy planes. Another good photo, a good profile photo of the Marge aircraft. And there's an interesting story here with this plane, in that I want to say around March of 1944, it was flown by another pilot on a weather reconnaissance mission over New Guinea, and he suffered an engine failure in bad weather and ended up bailing out over the jungle. And so the Marge P-38 ended up crashing into the jungle, and the pilot was rescued. He was really fortunate to escape with his life. He was able to make his way down through the steep slopes and everything to a stream, and then work his way downstream on this small stream or river until he encountered American troops and was taken back to his unit. He was lucky because a tremendous number of planes did crash. Both Japanese and American planes did crash in the jungles of New Guinea, and many of the pilots were just never found. It was so remote, and the terrain was extremely rugged, and there were all kinds of ways that, that's sort of like that 8 million ways to die, just whether it was from snakes or even crocodiles, or just, if you got lost and dying of starvation. A lot of pilots did not survive going down in the jungle. So that pilot was lucky. And then remarkably, 80 years later, or almost 80 years later, in March of 2024, an expedition led by the Pacific Rex organization, led by a guy named Justin Talon, with support of the Bong Veterans Historical Center, they actually were able to find the wreckage of that plane in the jungle. And there are some YouTube videos and other productions that are up online about the rediscovery of that particular P-38.
Are they planning on bringing it back at all, or pieces of?
I don't believe so. I can't answer that specifically, but my understanding is that there was very, very little of it left, and most of it was buried in the jungle. They were able to find a few pieces, and they were able to find a piece that had the serial number on it to confirm that it was the right plane. And some of the red paint, you can see that the prop spinners there, you can't tell in the black and white photo, but the prop spinners and the tip of the wings had red paint on them that was pretty distinctive. And so they were able to determine that it was actually that airplane.
Is that him sleeping under the wing?
I don't know. Yeah. I would say it's more likely that it would be the crew chief.
Yeah.
But I don't really know for certain, Steve.
I've seen this picture when we were putting the presentation together, and just looking at it now, I realized there was someone underneath there.
Yeah, well, they're like sort of like cattle will always look for shade under a tree. I mean, that was the only place they could get out of that blistering sun. Yeah, getting in the shade of the airplane. It's a very good shot of him in the cockpit. Again, it's a publicity photo. He's posing for a correspondent or photographer here, but it's a really good, a very good photograph of him, and he's a pleasant guy. Just a modest, fairly humble, small town kid. He was a farm boy, and that's why General Kenny referred to him as that blonde-haired Swedish boy. He was sort of cherubic, according to Kenny, and I think that defined his persona pretty well. It was after that third tour when he scored quite a few more victories, got all the way up to 40 victories, which still stands as the all-time American record, that he was awarded the Medal of Honor in the Philippines, which by that time, that's where they were operating from. The war had, the campaign had moved all the way from New Guinea up to the Philippines. He was awarded the Medal of Honor there in December of 1944 by General Douglas MacArthur. And then he's shown here with General Kenny on the left, who's actually even shorter than Bong. Kenny was quite a small guy. And then there's General MacArthur, and then Bong is on the other side in this rather, it's a little bit of a scratchy photo. And here we are again with Bong on the left, MacArthur in the center, and General George Kenny on the right. So again, Bong was in tall cotton. He was sort of the golden boy in that theater of the war, as well as a national hero back home. And now he's got his brand new Medal of Honor pinned to his shirt. And it's kind of interesting. He's got his sidearm strapped on still somewhere there in the Philippines and he's now a major, by the way. He went from, going overseas as a second lieutenant to making first lieutenant pretty quickly, and then was promoted to captain at the end of that first combat tour at the end of a year when he had 21 victories, and then was promoted to major about the same time that he was awarded the Medal of Honor. So he's Major Bong, but actually had never had any real leadership despite his rank. So after that third combat tour and the Medal of Honor, he went back home, arriving, I think it was New Year's Eve of 1945. And then in February, just a little over a month later, he and Marge got married in the Concordia Lutheran Church in Superior. And their wedding was attended by a full church and even a huge crowd outside on the street who were really thrilled. And this was regarded as as a celebrity wedding. It was publicized in Time magazine, and there were newspapers that were reporting this as one of the top celebrity weddings of 1945. So it's really amazing how this small town couple became so widely publicized. They went out to LA after he spent some time at Wright-Patterson, or not Patterson then, it was Wright Field in Ohio. He went there for school for the test pilot program. So, learning the procedures and protocols and everything for flight test, because he had already exhibited his interest in flying the P-80. And then meanwhile, he and Marge settled into an apartment out there in Los Angeles and had a great time. And he started flying at the Lockheed factory in Burbank, California, outside of Los Angeles. And he had about 10 or 11 test flights starting in early August of 1945, flying this aircraft, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, which was considered the fastest airplane in the American inventory at that time. It was a hot rod, and because it was the hottest new fighter in the military, that was what Bong wanted to fly. He indicated that specifically, and because he was the ranking ace of aces and had the Medal of Honor, the Army gave him his preference and sent him out. So he was an Army officer working in the acceptance flight section at Lockheed. In other words, Lockheed would produce a plane, it would roll out of the factory. A Lockheed representative would inspect it and go all through it, make sure everything was buttoned up and ready to go. And then an Army pilot would take the plane out on an acceptance check flight. And I believe probably Lockheed would have flown the plane as well before turning it over to the Army and saying, okay, it's all, it's ready for your acceptance check flight. And that was Bong's capacity as an acceptance. They call him a test pilot, but it was really more of an acceptance check flight to make sure that everything was ready. And then the Army would sign for it. And then, Lockheed would turn it over to the Army. So he was flying in those types of flights. They were very short. After 10 flights, he only had about 4.5 hours of flight time in a P-80. So you can do the math and figure each one was less than 30 minutes. So, maybe 20, 25 minutes of an acceptance flight. Probably went out over the Pacific, ran it through some basic things to check out that everything was working, and then flew it back to Burbank and said, okay, it's accepted, and the Army would take it over. So on August the 6th, he went out and took off in a plane that unfortunately had an engine surge or some type of flame out just 50 feet off the runway. He got it airborne, apparently got the gear retracted, got up to about 400 feet, but the surges or flame outs or whatever was causing this. The plane went into a stall. He was able to direct it towards a very large utility right-of-way, and that's where the plane came down. And he did try to jump, but he was too low for his parachute to open. The plane came down and smashed into the ground and exploded, and Bong came down very close by, but his chute didn't open, and he was killed on impact with the ground. You can see here in this photograph in the lower foreground that several people are actually loading his body up, and they're about to put it into that Army ambulance. He was not burned. He was, just killed on impact with the ground. It was really tragic. There was more controversy surrounding this accident because of the fact that on at least one previous flight, he had been dinged for not turning on an emergency or backup fuel pump. And there is no absolute way to know whether or not he had turned on that fuel pump on this flight. But because of that previous incident, the word sort of got around that, Bong didn't turn on his fuel pump. There's really no way to prove that.
So, Bruce, this accident, obviously very high profile. We see a large crowd there as well. Did word get out to the public who had been flying that airplane?
Well, there's an interesting story behind that, Steve. The crowd, a big crowd did appear at the crash scene, and word did get out quite quickly about what had happened, but they weren't exactly sure who it was at first. In fact, back at Lockheed, nobody was quite sure who was in the cockpit of the plane that had taken off, and there was a bit of confusion there. And as this crowd gathered around and word got out, unfortunately, a reporter or radio announcer or something like that from the Los Angeles area broadcast the word on the radio, at least very soon after the crash had happened, that Major Bong had been killed in this accident. And Marge happened to be at their apartment and heard it on the radio. I mean, that's how she learned about it. So it was very unfortunate that this unscrupulous radio station broadcaster put the word out publicly about who was killed. And it was a shock, needless to say, to Marge. And then because of that, then other stations picked it up, and evidently Bong's family also heard about it on the radio before they were notified by the Army. So it was a very unfortunate sequence that occurred before the next of kin could be notified. And you can see the size of the crowd here. I think the one remarkable aspect of this crash is that it's pretty evident that Bong made a deliberate attempt and succeeded in steering this crippled P-80 into this broad right-of-way, a utility right-of-way, so that he came down in just in an undeveloped area. And so he did not hit any structures. Nobody else on the ground was hurt or injured. He overflew a lot of, the densely populated area around Los Angeles with this plane, flaming out. And so it was actually quite heroic of him to bring the plane down where it wasn't going to hurt or kill anybody. And you can see the debris was scattered very widely here. And the cleanup took a while, but there you can see the right of way. I mean, he didn't even hit any of the high tension wires. So, from the looks of things, he might have knocked out power to, a good portion of the Los Angeles area if he had, but he didn't even hit the high tension wires. So he was able to bring it down where he lost his life, but nobody else did.
And as you had mentioned in the final reports, did not blame pilot error?
That's right. There was no determination whatsoever that, the accident was his own doing. They could not tell from the switches in the cockpit, which was basically totally destroyed, whether or not the fuel pump had been activated. But at the end of the day, they issued in their final report, and I think you have that in this next image down at the bottom. It says, the investigating board concludes that the accident was due to power plant malfunction and that there is no evidence of pilot error. And that's the Army's final say in this incident. Yes, Bong lost his life and it was extremely tragic, but there is no evidence whatsoever that he did something wrong that caused the plane to crash. In fact, the P-80 had a real notoriety early on in its service. Bong was the 6th fatality already. There had been 5 previous accidents. In fact, one had exploded over, I believe, Kentucky or Ohio, somewhere here in the east. One had exploded with a pilot on August 1st or 2nd, just a few days before Bong's crash. What was kind of remarkable about this was that the headlines the following day shared not only the story of Bong's crash, but of the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan, which it didn't actually happen on the same day. There's actually a little bit of misunderstanding about how that works, but there's actually a 13-hour time difference between Tokyo time and Washington, D.C. And so Hiroshima was bombed on the morning of August 6th, Japan time, but it was 13 hours earlier. It was basically in the evening of August the 5th when that occurred, U.S. time. And even earlier, it was afternoon of August 5th, California time.
Right.
So by the time everything was publicized on the morning of August 7th in the newspapers, so it looked as though they happened at the same time, that Bong's crash on August 6th and the bombing of Hiroshima actually took place at the same time. But accounting for the international date line and the time zone differences and everything, that's not quite exactly the right sequence. Anyway, it was very widely publicized, and within a day or two, Bong's casket was flown back to Superior, and then Marge was on the same aircraft. She was so distraught that a nurse went with her, and I believe that she was somewhat sedated because of her mental state after the shock of hearing on the radio that her husband of just
6 months.
6 months
roughly,
had been killed. Yeah. So that was just such a tragedy for her and for the Bong family. So this shows his casket being unloaded, and then the funeral back at the same church where they had been married 6 months earlier was attended by thousands. I mean, you can see the size of the crowd outside the church as his casket is being taken out from the church toward a waiting hearse. And then there was a huge procession going out to the Poplar Cemetery in the little village where he grew up. And so there's even quite a large crowd there at the Poplar Cemetery for his burial. It was several months later that a movement started to memorialize him, and then eventually, I believe it was in the 1950s that a memorial was first erected near the school that he attended with a P-38 up on a pedestal. And that was attended by General Kenny and many others. And eventually, Marge, she did remarry and had a very productive, long life out in California. But after that husband died, she eventually did move back to Wisconsin, and in fact settled not very far from the Bong family farm in Poplar, and was an instrumental part of getting the Bong Veterans Historical Center organized and built, and it is now a really vibrant and vital part of the military history museum facilities that we find across the country. But it's a world-class facility there near Lake Superior, and I highly encourage anybody who has the opportunity to visit that facility to do so. They've got a P-38 there. They have some of Bong's memorabilia there from the family, and it's really quite an amazing facility, well organized, well run, with really top-notch displays.
Very good. Interestingly, as we were putting this together, and I was doing a little research on Major Bong, if he wouldn't have perished in the crash, if let's say that didn't happen and he continued on in his military service, retired, whatever would have happened, with a lot of in the 60s, 70s and beyond, a lot of the especially the fighter pilots, Joe Foss, Chuck Yeager, all start writing books and doing appearances at air shows and things like that. Given his, I know it's hard to project, but given his nature, at least what we knew of him in his 25 years, do you think he would have been someone to write a book about his experiences, or to go to air shows or sign autographs?
He probably got a taste for that sort of publicity from all of his war bond tours, and the people that he met. He was on stage a lot during those times that he came home and did things with Bing Crosby and other leading Hollywood stars. So he was certainly capable of doing that kind of thing, but he really was not that comfortable with it. And my personal feeling, of course, never knowing him, but from what I can discern about his personality, I think he would have been far more comfortable being, in Wisconsin, doing the things that he enjoyed doing, being an outdoorsman, flying. He had actually purchased 2 Stearmans. He was going to fly one for himself, and he was going to give the other one to his younger brother, Carl Bong Jr., who everyone called Bud. But he purchased 2 surplus Stearmans at some point before he was killed. And so I think he was going to enjoy flying for himself. I don't know that he would have been interested in staying in the military and then being part of what became the U.S. Air Force. I couldn't answer to that or project that. But I think he certainly was not a Greg Boynton. He didn't have that showboating type of personality. Foss did not. He was more of a modest, South Dakota, a Midwestern person of modesty. And so I think Bong would have kind of followed in his general pattern, maybe. Yes, probably written about himself, but I don't think he would have been egotistical about it. I think he might have just done it maybe at the urging of other people to tell his story. I don't know if I could really project much more to your question at this point.
Yeah. General Kinney, he goes from calling Bong on the carpet for flat hatting to really being his biggest advocate throughout the war. So you mentioned him as a mentor. Is that really something that General Kinney had ever talked about?
Well, he mentor maybe wasn't quite the right adjective, but yes, as certainly as being an advocate, yeah, he was a promoter. General Kinney, he had a big ego for a small man, and he wanted publicity. And so he actually used his top fighter pilots like Bong and McGuire and Lynch for, you could say, for his own means. In other words, he wanted those guys to go out and shoot down more planes than anybody else to make his 5th Air Force look great. So there was a selfish aspect to this in his promoting people. And really, at the end of the day, it was, he was pushing them. And so, Lynch didn't survive it. McGuire didn't survive it. Gerald Johnson did survive it, but ended up getting killed in an operational crash later. So a lot of these guys did not actually survive the war. And so there's a little bit of a yin and yang to the way Kenny promoted. I think it came at a cost. And it was, I think, for his own, partly because of his own ego that he wanted to push these guys. Kenny wrote a book about Bong. He wrote a fairly small book. I think it was, I'm trying to think of the title of it, but I think it may have just been, Richard Bong, Ace of Aces, something along those lines. And of course, Kenny did write his own autobiography called General Kenny Reports. Mm-hmm. And I think that was where a lot of the promoter personality in General Kenny came from. but he genuinely did like Bong. I mean, he was just, what was not to like in Bong's personality and his character. So Kenny appreciated him.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, we appreciate you taking time to share this story with us and kind of dig in depth into Richard Bong. I mean, it's only 25 when the P-80 crash happened, and this is the 80th anniversary of that incident. Is a lot of what ifs are there, but still the story is pretty fantastic.
Yeah, in fact, he was not quite 25. He would have been 25 about 5-6 weeks later, and so he was just a 24-year-old youngster, eager to get back home to the family and that kind of thing. And unfortunately, that was not fated to happen. But a remarkable young man, and his record will probably never be equaled or surpassed, especially nowadays with, unmanned aircraft and everything else being standoff and computerized. When you think about people having to get onto another plane and get close enough to use machine guns or automatic cannon, they had to get close, and it was individual versus individual, pilot versus pilot at that time. It wasn't all automated. So that makes his accomplishment even more amazing.
Certainly is. Well, again, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, viewers, for joining us tonight. We'd like to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode or ideas you have for a future episode. Feel free to drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. And if you like tonight's show, please share it across your social media platforms. And remember to subscribe and click the bell icon. You'll get notifications when our new episodes are posted on YouTube. Until next time, I'm Steve Buss, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.